Welcome to podcast Sarah and Michael.
Welcome to the deep dive. I'm Michael.
And I'm Sarah.
I was looking at the massive stack of briefings we have for today's topic, and it really struck me how something that sounds like just another dry political handshake can actually, rewrite the rules of global finance.
Oh, absolutely. It is one of those moments where the most important changes in the world are disguised as the most boring-sounding bureaucratic updates.
Right.
You really have to read the fine print to see the earthquake, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, imagine you're sitting at a massive, high-stakes global poker game. The player who has essentially controlled the table, dealt the cards, set the rules for decades, they just stand up to leave the room for a minute.
And the very second the door clicks shut, two other heavyweights at the table slide all their chips together, look at each other, and decide they aren't going to play by the house rules anymore.
Exactly. They're inventing a completely new game with their own chips.
And that new game is what we're unpacking today. We're looking at a stack of recent geopolitical and financial reports detailing what might be the most significant shift in global economics of our lifetime.
Which is Russian President Vladimir Putin's highly anticipated official visit to Beijing on May 19th and 20th to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping.
Right, and on the surface, this looks like your standard, highly choreographed diplomatic visit. You have the handshakes, the photo ops, the formal statements in front of the flags.
But our mission for this deep dive is to look right past all that pageantry. We are looking specifically at the strategic weaponization of the Russian ruble and the Chinese yuan.
And how these two nations are actively trying to completely reroute global supply chains, yeah.
And look, if you are listening to this right now thinking about how high-level diplomacy halfway across the world affects your daily life, the answer is absolutely everything.
Seriously, everything.
The way these two massive superpowers decide to trade oil, manufacture goods, and move money, it directly impacts global inflation, the cost of the technology sitting in your living room right now, and the entire future of the global economy.
Right. If they successfully build a parallel economic system, the prices of everyday goods in your local store will fundamentally change.
So let's start with the timing, because before we can even begin to understand the financial mechanics of their new trade strategy, we really have to talk about the hyper-specific timing of this meeting.
Yeah, the timing is wild.
Putin's arrival in Beijing happens almost the exact second after U.S. President Donald Trump leaves China.
Right, so to give some context from the reporting, President Trump had just wrapped up bilateral talks with President Xi Jinping.
Right.
And those talks saw very little progress on major global disputes, specifically regarding Taiwan and the ongoing conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Iran.
Basically, the U.S. visit was essentially a stalemate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It ended in gridlock.
So you have this high-profile U.S. visit that ends in a gridlock, and then Putin lands. It's the geopolitical equivalent of a strategic double booking.
That's a great way to put it.
It's like, say you own a business, and you schedule a lavish lunch with your most loyal business partner the exact minute your biggest rival walks out of the building. You do it purely to send a message about where your real priorities lie.
Yeah, by hosting Putin right on the heels of a rather fruitless meeting with the U.S. president, Xi Jinping and Putin are actively positioning their alliance as the stable, reliable alternative.
They're projecting unity and momentum precisely where the U.S.-China talks projected friction.
And they have a historical milestone to anchor this unity to, which is really important. This visit marks the 25th anniversary of the 2001 Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation Treaty,
which was originally signed by Putin and former Chinese President Jiang Zemin. And I just want to point out, a 25-year treaty in international relations is a massive deal.
Oh, yeah. It's not just an excuse to cut a cake for the cameras.
Right. That 2001 agreement is the foundational architecture that has allowed them to align their economic interests across multiple industries for a quarter of a century.
It provides a level of institutional inertia that outlasts typical election cycles or, short-term political shifts in other countries.
So they are now basically building an extension on that foundation. They are preparing to sign new bilateral agreements and a brand new joint statement to strengthen their institutional ties.
Exactly. They're looking at the rapidly changing landscape of global trade alliances, and they're upgrading their 25-year-old operating system to handle current pressures.
Right. The political cover of this anniversary allows them to deepen their partnership in a way that feels historically justified rather than just, purely reactionary to the current news cycle.
Which brings us from the political theater right into the engine room.
Yes. Let's get into the engine room.
The 25-year treaty provides the diplomatic smiles, But the actual machinery of this alliance is being built behind closed doors in the economic meetings.
Right. So Putin is specifically targeting talks with Chinese Premier Liu Qiang, and the focus of those meetings is incredibly granular. Like they're reviewing current trade frameworks, analyzing customs data, and pushing to streamline cross-border economic cooperation.
And the term being used heavily in the documents is supply chain harmonization.
Okay, I have to jump in and ask for some translation here because my eyes tend to just glaze over when I hear phrases like supply chain harmonization and
Yeah.
reviewing customs frameworks.
It does sound like an incredibly dry corporate board meeting, yeah.
Exactly. What does this actually look like in the real world? Are we talking about laying down new train tracks across Asia, rewriting tax codes? What is the actual physical and digital manifestation of this?
Well, the dry language absolutely masks the sheer scale of what they're attempting. When they say harmonization, they are talking about a massive survival mechanism. The goal is to integrate and connect supply chains and investment routes across the entire Eurasia region. In practice, this means creating an economic zone where a physical product can move from a factory in China to a distributor in Russia without ever hitting a regulatory bottleneck.
So it's not just building a new bridge or a new railway, it's integrating the software and the bureaucracy.
Right.
If I'm shipping a container of microchips, I don't want it sitting at a border crossing for 2 weeks while agents translate customs forms.
That is the core of it.
Yep.
They are linking their digital customs databases.
Yeah.
By sharing that data, they're creating pre-cleared logistics routes.
Oh, wow.
The overarching strategy is to establish border crossings and trade regulations that do not require Western ports, do not rely on Western regulatory approvals, and cannot be easily tracked or blocked by Western authorities.
So it is essentially a defensive maneuver against increasingly strict international regulations.
Yes. If your logistics software and your customs protocols are completely integrated, you effectively remove the border friction that traditional global trade relies on to enforce sanctions.
It's like creating a geopolitical HOV lane where their goods just breeze past the checkpoints that slow everyone else down.
That's exactly it.
And to do that successfully over the long term, you need human beings who know how to drive in that lane. I noticed in the materials that amidst all this heavy economic restructuring, they're officially launching the Russia-China Year of Education for 2027 to 2028.
Which is fascinating, right?
Yeah. At first glance, an education initiative seems totally disconnected from supply chains.
Yeah, it does, but it's actually the most crucial piece of the puzzle. You cannot have a harmonized supply chain if your engineers, your customs agents, and your software developers don't understand each other's systems.
Oh, so the Year of Education is basically a talent pipeline.
Exactly. They are aligning their academic institutions so the next generation of workers speaks both languages, understands both legal codes, and can seamlessly operate the shared software platforms we were just talking about.
Right. They're building the human capital required to run a parallel economy.
Yes, because you can build all the new train tracks, integrate all the custom software, and train all the bilingual engineers you want across Eurasia.
But none of it matters if you still have to pay for the goods using someone else's currency.
Precisely. You cannot build a truly independent, parallel Eurasian economy if you are still paying for everything using the traditional Western-dominated banking systems.
Which leads us to the absolute core of our deep dive today, and really the most significant economic takeaway from the briefings, the currency play.
This is where we see the economic impact of this alliance most clearly. To set the stage, after Western sanctions heavily restricted Russia's access to the global economy, China stepped in and became the primary buyer of Russian oil and Russian goods.
So today, China is Russia's #1 trading partner.
Right. And the critical detail here is the mechanism of that trade. Almost all transactions between these two nations are now conducted exclusively in Russian rubles and Chinese yuan.
And that is just a monumental shift. For decades, the global standard for international trade, especially for commodities like oil, has been the US dollar.
Oh, absolutely.
It's as if you got permanently banned from using the world's most popular payment app, the one literally every store in town uses. But instead of apologizing and trying to get your account back, you and your wealthiest friend just decided to create your own private economy.
Right. You printed your own money, decided what it was worth between the two of you, and completely bypassed the app altogether.
Let's look at the mechanics of why that bypass is so effective. Putin has explicitly criticized Western sanctions, calling them, quote, discriminatory.
And trading strictly in rubles and yuan is their direct countermeasure. When global trade is conducted in US dollars, Those transactions generally have to clear through correspondent banks that touch the U.S. financial system.
Right, and that gives Western institutions visibility into the trade, which means they have the jurisdiction to freeze assets, block transfers, or enforce sanctions.
Because the money eventually crosses a server or a ledger that the West controls. But if you aren't using the U.S. dollar, that visibility just vanishes.
Completely vanished.
It completely vanishes. If Russia sells millions of barrels of oil to China, and China pays for it using a domestic currency clearinghouse system that only processes yuan.
Then that transaction never touches a Western bank?
Exactly. It never enters a jurisdiction where it can be intercepted. They are effectively creating a financial fortress.
A fortress that neutralizes the economic pressure the West tried to apply. I mean, the whole point of the sanctions was to starve the Russian economy by cutting off its ability to sell goods and receive dollars.
Yeah, so this ruble-yuan strategy is a massive, highly lucrative loophole. And the mechanics of this are fascinating because it means they are actively choosing to absorb currency risk.
Okay, explain that a bit more. What do you mean by absorbing currency risk?
Well, that is a vital point to understand. The U.S. dollar is popular because it is incredibly stable and universally accepted. By switching to the ruble and the yuan, Russia and China were taking on the risk of currency fluctuation.
Right. The value of their money might go up or down wildly compared to the dollar.
Exactly. They are deciding that geopolitical security, the ability to trade without fear of sanctions, is far more valuable to them than the convenience and stability of the dollar.
Wow. And it goes beyond just surviving current sanctions, doesn't it? By proving that two massive industrialized economies can conduct high-volume trade without the dollar, they are setting a dangerous precedent for the traditional financial system.
Oh, definitely. They are showing other nations who might feel squeezed by international regulations that there is a viable alternative way to do business.
Which brings us back to you listening to this. If the dollar loses its dominance as the absolute required currency for global trade, the demand for the dollar drops.
And that ripples through the entire U.S. and global economy. It fundamentally alters inflation rates, the cost of borrowing money, and the price of imported goods.
Yeah, if supply chains split into two competing systems, the efficiency of global trade breaks down, and everyday consumer products become more expensive to produce and ship.
So we are watching them construct this airtight economic and financial integration, but, and this is a big but, this reality directly clashes with the geopolitical image China is trying to project to the rest of the world right now.
Yeah, it creates a massive paradox.
China officially tries to maintain a neutral stance on the global stage, specifically regarding the Russia-Ukraine war. They have actively tried to position themselves as a peace mediator in the conflict.
But their actions on the economic front tell a much different story. The source materials describe this as a no-limits partnership with Russia.
Right, and that economic reality heavily undermines the claim of diplomatic neutrality.
Now, I need to pause here for a second. We must explicitly state that we are not taking a stance on the Ukraine war, the validity of Western sanctions, or the definition of unilateralism here.
Right. We are simply unpacking the strategic viewpoints presented by the leaders in the source material. We are looking at the mechanics of statecraft based on the documents.
Exactly. So, looking at this purely from a strategic geopolitical perspective. Imagine you are trying to mediate a dispute between two parties. How does a country successfully act as a credible global peace mediator while simultaneously serving as the primary economic lifeline for one of the combatants?
That is the tightrope China is attempting to walk, and it is incredibly precarious. The reporting highlights that China has had to actively deny media claims that Chinese companies are helping supply parts for Russian drone production.
Which shows how blurred the line becomes, right? The closer their economies integrate, the more their supply chains harmonize and their customs data merges, the harder it becomes to separate standard commercial trade from military support in the eyes of the international community.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because if China is buying massive amounts of oil and providing billions in funding through trade using their own currencies, the economic engine of the state is being fueled regardless of whether actual weapons are being shipped.
Right, the money is flowing. And the rhetoric from the leaders during this visit strongly backs up this unified front. Xi Jinping openly pledged to stand with Russia against what he calls unilateralism.
And we need to define how the sources are using that term, because it is the ideological glue holding this economic strategy together.
Right. What exactly do they mean by unilateralism?
Unilateralism, in this context, is defined as one country, or a small group of aligned countries, basically implying the U.S. and its Western allies, making global decisions alone without consulting others or relying on broader international bodies.
So when Xi and Putin are shaking hands and signing these new frameworks, they are framing their entire economic alliance as a shared defense against this concept of Western unilateralism.
Yeah, connecting this to the bigger picture. They are framing their economic survival tactics not just as a temporary way to dodge sanctions, but as a righteous fight for a multipolar world.
And a multipolar world is one where power is distributed among several global centers, right?
Exactly. A world where the West doesn't get to unilaterally dictate the rules of global finance and trade. To them, the strategy of trading in rubles and yuan isn't just a business decision to keep oil flowing.
It is a geopolitical weapon designed to force that multipolar reality into existence.
Spot on.
So let's bring all these threads together because we've covered a lot of really complex ground today. What we are seeing with this meeting between Putin and Xi in Beijing is far more than a diplomatic courtesy call to fill the void after the U.S. president's exit.
It is a highly calculated strategic summit. The overarching goal is to take a 25-year foundational alliance and upgrade it into a heavily fortified, sanctions-proof Eurasian economy.
Right. They're integrating their customs data, aligning their logistics networks, and even preparing their future workforce through educational exchanges to run a completely parallel supply chain.
A supply chain that operates entirely on its own tracks, bypasses Western regulatory ports, and most importantly, runs completely on Russian rubles and Chinese yuan.
They are building a financial fortress designed to withstand shifting global pressures, absorb currency risks, and neutralize traditional economic weapons like sanctions. We are, witnessing the real-time testing of an alternative global system.
It really forces a critical view of the future. I mean, the traditional global economy has operated under one dominant set of financial rules for a very long time.
Which brings us back to that poker game from the beginning. They've pushed their chips together and they are playing a new game with their own currency.
Yeah, they really are.
So here is the lingering thought I want to leave you with, something to really chew on long after this deep dive ends. If China and Russia successfully prove over the next few years that two massive industrialized economies can conduct all their cross-border trade completely outside the traditional dollar-dominated global financial system.
What happens when other countries around the world decide they want to join that alternative network?
Exactly. What does the global economy look like when there isn't just one dominant financial system, but two actively competing ones fighting for influence?
It changes the price of everything and the balance of power everywhere.
It really does. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.